and about land restoration. But there's going to be an opportunity between each topic to discuss anything that you guys need to touch up on, or let's see. I'm trying to set up my presentation real quick. Okay, let me share my screen. All right. It's loading up right now. All right. So first of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who's supporting us, everyone who's showed up today and supporting us individually, but also people in POC Fungi group, Mar and Crystal, Pao, Chris, Samantha, Mario, just everyone that's been supporting. You know, I love y'all. Y'all are literally the best people. And I'm very grateful that Bao was the first presenter, because it's very important to remind ourselves of our connection to the earth. In this world, humans have a big ego where we don't even refer to ourselves as animals, that we're not animals, even though we really are animals. But just like to recognize that, like, we are from this earth, our medicine comes from this earth, everything we need is here, there's an abundance of it. And just to recognize that, like, we're connected to that, and we should remain connected to that. And that spirituality is only half of the story, and science is only half of the story. They are both relevant to each other. They're just different languages. They're both just ways of understanding life and the way that it operates and the way that we operate in it. So I'm going to get started on this presentation. Like I said, between each topic, I'm going to give a chance for people to ask questions to clarify anything, but there also will be time at the end for conversation if there's, because I'm trying to keep the questions relevant to the topics, but if your questions are not relevant to that specific topic, we can talk about it more at the end of the presentation. With that said, let's talk about the fungal life cycle. So there's more than one way to grow. And what I mean by that is, on this planet, there are millions of different types of fungi. And personally speaking, I can't speak for everyone, but I really don't think it's worth keeping a census of, because fungi are always adapting to their environments. They're always evolving and changing. So having an accurate number of what kind of fungi and how many fungi is impossible. And in this picture that you see, we're going to get back to it later, but those are 4 very different types of mushrooms. Mario had mentioned maybe a couple of them in the children's book that was read earlier. And I have this little thing, birth and rebirth. And I mentioned that because fungi are capable of creating an entirely new fungus, a brand new baby fungus. But they're also capable of regrowing. And that's kind of like how succulents, if a leaf falls off of a succulent, it just takes root and keeps growing. Same thing with mint. If you break it apart and plant it somewhere else, it can keep growing. As long as it has a sustainable food source and a good environment, they can virtually live forever. So let's talk about a new fungus. In most cases, the first development of a fungal offspring begins as a spore. It's very similar to how plants, they start off as a seed, but fungi are the original copies. Give me a sec here. So this is a diagram of the fungal life cycle, where we're going to begin at the top. Before I explain the fungal life cycle, I do want to say that the mushroom itself is only the fruiting body. Its only purpose in the mycelium's life and the fungi's life is to reproduce and spread its spores. That is the only reason why it develops. So I don't know why this is popping up on top, but anyways, so yeah, you have a spore. We're going to talk about growing conditions later, but the spore finds a good environment for itself, and it starts to germinate. And as it germinates, these strings of fungi will branch out, and those little branches that you see are called hyphae. Those hyphae, their purpose is to reach out and search for resources, find a better condition, better lighting, more food, more water, that kind of stuff. And eventually, as it branches out and gains more resources and grows more, they start to form over each other, creating a thicker and healthier organism, a more effective organism. And the mycelium mat underneath the earth, like that's actually the main organism of the fungi. And remember that the mushroom itself is only meant for reproduction. So as the mycelium matures and it's ready to produce that fruiting body, it goes to the stage of imperfection. So it tries to create fungi, but they kind of come out a little wonky, not very tall, very tiny. And that's kind of just the trial and error of the mycelium trying to find the better conditions for the fruiting body. And as it develops and finds the proper conditions, the mushroom cap will begin to get larger. The stem will begin to lift above ground. And once it reaches maturity, the mushroom cap will start to expand. And there's a little skirt underneath that kind of protects the gills that are underneath the mushroom until it's fully matured. And then once it's matured and opened up completely, it releases its spores. And there's a number of ways that spores get spread around. In this kind of method, it's just very common for the spores to just drop down and onto the floor and start forming new hyphae and new mycelium, all of that. I think it's important to make the distinction that when you grow from an offspring, from a spore, you're getting an evolved genetic material. So this is like the next step. This is the child of that mushroom. So that mushroom has already adapted to its environments and to its conditions. So the spore is the evolution of that mycelium, of that fungi. And when you grow from the mycelium, if you just have mycelium and you break it apart and spread it around, you're going to regrow that same mushroom and same genetic coding unless it adapts to its new environment. So next step, this is the mushroom anatomy. I'm not going to get too much into mushroom anatomy because there's just so many different types of mushrooms, and this is not an accurate depiction for all mushrooms. This is just a common thing right here. You got the caps, the gills. There's underneath mushrooms, there's different types of storage for the spores. Commonly, you'll see gills, which look like the lines underneath. But if those gills are kind of wavy and they're not very consistent and like symmetrical or anything like that, they form these weird patterns that are referred to as teeth. And then there's also mushrooms that they're called polypores, and they hold their spores into these little holes underneath them. And I'm going to show some examples of that later. So here's the 4 pictures again, and I wanted to show it again because I wanted to share the very different styles of growth that they have. This bottom left picture right here is a picture of an Inky Cat mushroom. And when it reaches full maturity, the cap of the mushroom will start to disintegrate, and these black spores will start to drip away from the rim, and it's really cool looking. On this bottom right picture is a picture of a puffball mushroom that Mario shared in the book. And in order for them to spread their spores, something has to come in contact with it. Either an animal steps on it or tries to eat it and pushes on it. A curious human just pokes at it for fun. But yeah, in order for them to regrow, they have to something has to interact with them. And I think that's very neat. This top right picture is of a shiitake mushroom growing on wood. And you can see a cloud of spores being released beneath it. And I think the photographer did a really cool job capturing that. I think it's really pretty. And this is kind of like the what we're used to seeing. Like most of the mushrooms that we see kind of do this one right here, spread out like that. And on this top left picture is a picture of Amadou mushrooms growing on a birch tree. And this is a polypore. This doesn't have gills. It just has a bunch of pores underneath it that hold on to the spores. And I'm going to show an example of that in a second. So here's that. There's two pictures of mushrooms that show the gills underneath right here. And then here's a polypore. This is not a very good picture, but I want to share another picture in a second. But these two pictures on the top left and the bottom right is of gills underneath the microscope. And you can see like the green segment itself is the gill, and those little things holding onto it are the spores. And those will just hang on to it until they reach maturity or until something knocks it off. Or yeah. Here is a better picture of the underside of a polypore. This is taken by our friend Doga. You can see all those little dots hanging around, and it's kind of cool when you have one just sitting on your desk and like they just release their spores onto your desk and you see a bunch of like these brown little dots. Kind of cool. So that is the fungal life cycle, or a generic explanation of the fungal life cycle. If you have any questions about that right now, I'm gonna take the time to answer those. So if anyone wants to raise their hand or type in the comments, wait a minute for that one. Are reishi mushrooms polypore? I believe so. I believe they are. If you look up the underside of a reishi mushroom, they will have a bunch of little dots all over them. Right, I'm gonna wait one more minute, maybe less. Okay, I'm just gonna get into ecology now. So if you have any questions about the fungal life cycle, we can go back to it later. The great decayers. I like to call fungi that just because of their nature. I think it's fun wordplay. But let's talk about fungal nature. Fungi are the #1 decomposers on Earth's surface. You know, they break down and recycle Earth's organic matter, and some mushrooms are even capable of breaking down things that are harmful to other life forms. And I'm going to give more examples of that later. But essentially, their job is to make bigger things into smaller elements so that they can be redistributed into the ecosystem. They eat organic matter. So if there's a dead animal, there's a tree trunk, horse manure, anything natural that's no longer being used by nature, it gets decomposed by mycelium or fungi at some point. There are other decomposers like insects and animals and all that, but fungi are the main ones because when those insects die, the mycelium are eating them too. This top right picture is a picture of a carcass that has a bunch of mushrooms in the center. That makes a lot of sense because the stomach is where a lot of organic matter would be, including a bunch of microbes from the digestive tract. Here's a picture of mushrooms growing around a stump. I actually got to take a few of these pictures. But like, this is actually a very important task. And I'm going to zoom in on this one over here. If it wasn't for the constant task of decomposing that the mycelium do, there would be a huge buildup of matter. Like say all these pine needles around this mushroom, not a lot of things eat pine needles. Not a lot of things will break those down. So like if it wasn't for mycelium doing their job, there would just be piles of pine needles everywhere. And that's including the tree stump that you see in the top left corner over here. In order for new trees to grow, there needs to be space. And in order for them to grow healthy, there needs to be nutrients available. So the fungi will make the space by breaking things apart, clearing the space, and then also providing new elements for those new life. In this photo, you can also see a little slug underneath the mushrooms. I like to point it out because that slug is most likely going to assist in spreading the spores around, just by being underneath it. But also, if it were to eat the spores, it could poop it out later, creating better conditions for its growth. That's just one of the many ways spores get spread around. Growing mediums. So there's a lot of different ways to grow mushrooms at home or mycelium in general. People are getting very creative nowadays, especially keeping the fact in mind that some mushrooms are very tolerant to unnatural compounds and break them down easier, and people are experimenting with that. Anyways, I'll talk about that later. In this top right picture is a picture of a hay bale that's been inoculated with oyster mushrooms. And oyster mushrooms are actually very resilient. They're easy to grow in outdoor and indoor settings, very low maintenance. But all you really have to do is just spread the mycelium inside of the hay bale and then just hose it down and make sure it's got moisture. And given time, it will grow. I have grown oyster mushrooms in small jars before using just coffee grounds, very similar to this method down here. These bottom two right here in the jars, this is a grain culture, and the bottom right is a liquid culture. These are not typically the most efficient ways to grow mushrooms, especially the liquid cultures. You can't grow mushrooms from the liquid culture, but it is a really good way to expand your mycelium so that you can grow more mycelium and spread it out to more cultures or to more substrate and grow more mushrooms. So just a tiny bit of healthy mycelium from either of these jars placed into new substrate will take off. It will grow. On this top picture right here, you can see mycelium growing on cardboard. You can use a lot of things around the house to grow mycelium. Like I've seen people use cotton shirts and old shoes and stuff, and I think that kind of stuff takes more time and more training. Yes, and toilet paper. That's an excellent example. Let's look at this top left picture. This is wine cap mushrooms that are growing on mulch, and that's a very easy method because wine cap mushrooms themselves are also very resilient. They survive cold temperatures and pretty warm temperatures too. So like if you were to give everything an ice bath and just like slow down all the microbial activity, that mycelium would still be able to just like move around and eat stuff, and this is very resilient type of mushroom. And you could just use leaves and sticks and bark that's fallen on the floor to feed it. This bottom left picture is a log with shiitake mushrooms growing from it, and this is a very popular method of cultivating mushrooms, where all you got to do is drill holes into the log, soak the log, and then stuff the holes with either sawdust or wooden plugs that have been myceliated, and usually they'll cover those holes with a wax to protect it from being eaten by insects or being contaminated by other kinds of spores. And it kind of helps guarantee that mycelium will thrive on its own inside of the log. We can talk more about this later. There's a lot of different substrates you can use to grow mushrooms. Like I said, they break down organic matter, so you could literally just use like your tea bags. Let's see. So here's an example of a material I was referring to that's toxic to us. Hydrocarbons are toxic to us and a lot of other life forms as well. Probably all of them, the majority of them. But mushroom, mycelium, or fungi, they have this really awesome ability to break things apart on a molecular level to separate their elements and rearrange them in a way that's beneficial to them. So oil benzene over here is you can see hydrocarbon bonds. Hydrocarbon bonds are just hydrogen and carbon. And here is a picture of an experiment being done where it's a block of myceliated hay and oil being poured over it. And what they can do is rearrange those molecules and add another element, oxygen, and create carbohydrates. It turns them into sugars. And that is like one of the most impressive things I've ever seen from an organism. Here is the same experiment where mushrooms did sprout from it, growing very healthy mushrooms. I couldn't tell you whether those mushrooms are safe to eat. I'm not sure if enough research has been done behind that. But at the very least, by the mushrooms consuming the oil, they neutralize the substances. So it's no longer toxic to the environment, no longer harmful to other forms of life. And those elements are now easier to be decomposed by nature and, continues its cycle. And we're going to get into more examples of that later in the land restoration. Symbiotic relationships, the fungal network. The fungal network is referring to the mycelial mats that spread around and form relationships with the plant life around it. This is very important for ecosystems because it helps transfer nutrients and resources to one another, but also allows them to communicate whether there's a threat or anything that needs to be known towards each other. They can grow really, really big. So this is a picture of a mycelial mat that has grown close to 2,400 acres long and is approximately 2,200 years old. It is debatably the largest organism in the world. And that is really impressive because say like you walk in one end of the forest, the organisms on the complete opposite side will know that you're there. And this is kind of like the original designs for networking. Mycorrhizal fungi. This is referring to the mycelium or the fungi that form relationships specifically with the root systems of plants. If you break the word apart, myco is just referring to fungi and rhizal is referring to the root systems. And there's two categories of those. There's hundreds of different types of mycorrhizal fungi, but there's two ways that they grow, endo and ectomycorrhizal. And here is a diagram that just shows what their differences are. The main difference is one grows over the roots, ectomycorrhizal, and endomycorrhizae grow within. They'll lace themselves into the root systems and transfer through that. There's not a lot of research done on whether on which one's more effective. I don't think the endomycorrhizae has shown to be harmful to any of the plants. There's a lot of benefits that actually come with these kind of relationships. Let's talk about them. So plants that have these relationships with the fungi, they're protected in so many different ways. But because of the fact that they have a network available to them, they have more resources, more nutrients, and that allows them to grow deeper root systems, which gives them more stability and even greater ability to absorb things in their environment. Fungi are also very good at adapting, or they have really good immune systems. So they fight against pathogens quite easily. Like they will evolve to create antibodies to fight pathogens. So like if the plant has a relationship with it, it will protect it from any kind of plants, viruses, or not any kind, what it's adapted to. They also protect from pests like nematodes. Nematodes are these small worms that can grow in your root systems. So by having the mycelium in place, they kind of like they kind of attack the nematodes and kind of like encase them and suffocate them and then just absorb them. And that provides even more nutrients to the plant. And they're also good at retaining water. When mycelium are exposed to a lot of water, sometimes they'll create small pockets in order to fill them and store them for later. And because of that, that helps prevent moldy roots as well. When water just sits, it kind of just festers and leaves opportunity for other microbial activity and for molds to develop. So by having mycelium available, it either will transfer out the moisture, send it somewhere else, or it will save it for later, absorb it. Yeah. And like I said, with the deeper roots, because they're absorbing a lot of nutrients, because they're being protected from pathogens and from pests, they're able to grow bigger fruits and flowers. And a beautiful consequence to that is they leave healthier offsprings. So the next generation of flower or plant or tree, whatever, will be healthier than its parent. All right, so that's ecology. We can talk a little bit more like that. I'm gonna read the chats right now to see where you get questions we have. Is there a way to inoculate planting areas with mycorrhiza? Yes, absolutely. Um, let's say you have a garden bed. If you mix in straw or sawdust or just things that are easy for the fungi to eat, and then you add the mycelium or add spores for the particular type of mushroom that you want to grow, um, there are lists of mycorrhizal fungi, and there will be some that tell you what plants they're best compatible with. Unfortunately, I forgot to include that in my resources, but maybe we can carry that conversation for later. But anyways, yeah, you can inoculate your soil with the mycelium that's beneficial for your plants. And as long as you encourage it and protect it from, let's say, like protect it from other spores, from insects get into it, like they'll grow, they'll form a relationship. So does anyone have any more questions about ecology, about the fungal network, mycorrhizal fungi, anything like that? Let me give it a minute. All right, it seems like we don't have any questions at the moment, so we're gonna move on to ancestry. Planetary OGs, the billion-year-old ballers. Now, I call them that because no one really knows how long fungi have really been on the planet. They've been here so long, longer than any other life form. And if we claim that we know how long they've actually been here, they're lying, because we do not have a complete, accurate picture of how long they've been. Scientists have claimed to have found a sample that is 1 billion years old in I forgot where, the Arctic. They found a sample there, and I honestly believe it. I believe it because fungi are capable of surviving so many things. So, this picture on the right, these are called prototaxites. These are not the original fungus, but these are the original prototypes for large plants organisms like trees. This is the original. So, and these kind of existed around 500 million years ago in the prehistoric eras. And in that era, plants only grew to be about the size of human beings. They only grew about our height. Most of the plants were a lot smaller than that. So this is like Earth's original prototypes in creating something that reaches up, absorbs atmospheric carbon, absorbs sunlight. Like these are the original right here. However, life on Earth, before the creation of plants, animals, and insects, fungi, algae, and lichen inherited the planet, and they will continue to be here far after human beings. And As it says right here too, the fungi and algae have both survived and thrived throughout Earth's 5 mass extinctions. So algae and fungi are the original life forms of this planet. They're the original. Algae were the first ones to photosynthesize, and fungi were the first ones to decompose Earth's crusts. Now, it is theorized that lichen are the evolutionary descendants of both fungi and algae. And what is theorized is that at one point, um, microalgae splashed onto shore and were absorbed by fungi, and through trial and error have created a symbiotic relationship where the fungi will provide an environment for it, but also provide elements that it has broken down from rock. And then in return, the algae will photosynthesize and provide sugars to the fungi. And they've existed for millions and millions of years, and you can see them all over the place when you go to the mountains. These organisms are responsible for the creation of soil. Because before soil was here, it was just hard rock, everything was compacted. But because fungi or lichens excrete these enzymes that break down larger rock, they essentially churn those large materials into smaller ones and create soil. So through the last 5 mass extinctions, just think about it. There's a lot of death that's happening in those extinctions. So it's basically providing more food sources for these organisms. And because they already do well in environments that don't require sunlight and all of that, like they just took off. They did not even care. It did not like. However, what I have heard is that through the first mass extinction was called the Great Oxidation, and that was a period where plants were coming around and oxygen was being produced, and the life forms on this planet weren't capable of breathing oxygen at that time, so a lot of them just kind of died out. Well, fungi and algae adapted beautifully to that, and they're here today. Here's a closer picture of some lichens on a rock. They're so beautiful. Like, you can see so many different colors on the rocks. Like, this is just like a grayish green color, but there's like bright orange, red, greens, yellows. They're so beautiful. Let's see. Have mushrooms influenced human evolution? Absolutely. We are descendants from mushrooms. Like, we have the same ancestry. We are directly related to them. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but there's this theory called the stoned ape theory, which is believed that through evolution, when we were still early hominids, we consumed psilocybin mushrooms or psychedelic plants or fungi, and that helped create more neural networks in our brains and basically expanded our consciousness in a way that allowed us to evolve into a more logical and creative being. So on the right, you can see pictures of brain cells compared to the universe, compared to the internet web. And then on the bottom, you'll see mycelium network branching out. There's a lot of synchronicities in nature because nature has recognized that there's a very efficient way of creating. And it's so consistent, it's how we operate. Now in Paul Stamets books and his talks and all that, he says something along the lines of how the creation of the computer was inevitable because of the design of nature, like the way that the mycelium networks and all of that is very consistent with the way that computers operate, but less efficiently. The computers are less efficient than the natural design. So in Mexica culture in Nahuatl, the word for the magic mushroom is called Teo Nanacati. and the mushroom itself is Nanakat. And those are breaking down into these words right here. Teot meaning energy, Nantli being the mother, Mother Earth, and Akatl being the flesh or the meat. And our ancestors recognized that these mushrooms is basically the flesh of the earth. Like, it is, in my personal opinion, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who agree with this as well, but the flesh of our skin, the flesh that clings to our bones and all of that, mushrooms are responsible for that. Like, that they're the blueprints for us creating flesh. Like, if you just poke a mushroom, they're just very fleshy things. And I believe that these organisms were the ones who created the blueprints that eventually created our flesh. And the energy part right here, that is referring to the energetic response that the mushrooms give us. Like, the magic mushroom is the embodiment of our mother's energy, and that energy, when we absorb it, it affects us. You know, we're the children of the earth, and so our cells come from it, and our cells are affected by it. So yeah, I personally believe that we are direct descendants of fungi through a very, very long process, and that the creation of our flesh and the creation of our consciousness is heavily influenced by fungi. Absolutely. So that's ancestry, a little bit of the relationship with fungi. I didn't get too much into human history with fungi. I think Mario was going to talk more about that in his presentation. But does anyone have any questions of that?
I have a question.
Yes.
It's you mentioned fungi and algae. What about bacteria and archaea? Are they like around the same time?
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a good question. So another word for microalgae is cyanobacteria. That's a fancy scientific word that's used for microalgae. I don't think I displayed it here, but yeah, small organisms, bacteria. If you ever go walk near a river or a stream, you'll see algae growing, and like, you'll see the small oxygen bubbles. Like, those microorganisms are the foundations for life on this planet. So yeah, it's the same time period, and I think it's good to clarify that algae is also referred to as a not specifically a bacteria, but yeah, cyanobacteria. See, yes, let me type it up. Does anyone have any questions before I move on?
yes, brother. Is the bacteria as important as the fungi for the regeneration of forests and life and all that? And yeah, the soil.
I believe so. So microbes are very essential because they're also decomposers. They also break down large organisms into small organisms, but also because of their gas exchanges as well. The gases they produce, the fertilizers they leave behind, all of that is contributing to each other, and the growth and the death of those microorganisms also feed into larger life. So the microcosm has a big effect to the macrocosm. Any more questions, or was that good for you?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna move on to land restoration. Could talk about more stuff later. But here is a fancy word. Bioremediation is a fancy word for when natural organisms heal their environments. I'm sure there's a better definition out there, but I don't really care about Latin. I don't really care about colonizer words too much. I'm just trying to explain this to the best of my ability. But bioremediation is basically it can be broken up into two words: a biological remedy. It is using natural organisms to heal their environment. And I've included a picture of a sunflower because it's my favorite flower, but also because when I was creating a list of organisms that clean or absorb certain elements, and I'll show that later, sunflowers popped up and on every single list, or almost every single list. They're capable of absorbing so many materials that would be toxic to us and neutralizing it for us. So like, I think they deserve a shout out. And I'll talk about them more later. But here are some examples of what bioremediation can be used for. And let's talk about oil spills. This is a picture of the explosion of the oil rig off the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. I don't have the exact data for this event or what happened, but if y'all remember, like all those pictures are just like miles and miles of oil just spilled across the Gulf, and a bunch of animal life or marine life being affected by it as well. There are experiments that have been done that show how fungi can be used to help absorb that oil, to neutralize it and create a healthy environment again. This is a mycelium block that was trained, that was being acclimated to a saltwater environment containing oil. And doing experiments like this provides the mycelium the opportunity to evolve and become more efficient at its task. And then once you have a strain of mycelium that is good at what it does, you can expand the project, you can scale it up. And this is a burlap sack, or it's a sack that's filled with myceliated straw and is acclimated to saltwater environments and can absorb oil. And as you can see on the right, it produces mushrooms, and those are very healthy mushrooms too. I'm going to talk about an experiment that was done by Paul Stamets, that he was involved with the Gulf of Mexico cleanup. But what they did is that these researchers created 3 holes. One of them was filled, all of them were filled with oil from the spill, but one hole was filled with some kind of bacteria or enzyme. The other one was filled with bacteria, one was filled with enzymes, and the other one was filled with oyster mushroom mycelium. And they buried it up, and over time, the first 2 piles were rotting and like smelled nasty and decay, and there's just death on death, versus the pile that was inoculated with oyster mushrooms. The oyster mushrooms converted all of the oil into sugars and created a healthier soil. And the healthy mushrooms invited insects to eat it. The insects invited larger creatures to eat the insects, all of which were fertilizing the land. And eventually, plants were able to sprout. And, that continues the repairments of that ecosystem. So we know that if there was ever an oil spill, we are capable, or when there's oil spills, we are capable of containing the oil spill, or containing some of the oil and neutralizing it through the process of microremediation. And then we're able to train the mycelium so that we can utilize them on the water itself and absorb whatever's left in the water. This is not perfect, but it is a very, very good stepping stone into how humans should be responding when we make a mistake. Because we are always going to be responsible for our environments, and any kind of neglect it's a failure for everyone. Everyone's affected. At some point, everyone and everything is affected. So nuclear disasters. in Chernobyl in 1986, the nuclear reactor there exploded and caused the whole city of Chernobyl to be evacuated. And then in 2011, Fukushima, their nuclear plant also exploded. And I believe they're still dealing with radiation conflicts today. It's still leaking, it's still producing toxic waste. And even in Chernobyl, there's still high levels of radiation. The cool thing is that near Chernobyl, researchers have found mushrooms growing around the forestry in that area. And they found that the mushrooms were absorbing radiation from the blast. And that is very important because if you're unfamiliar with radiation, it's essentially an element that, so all elements have a certain number of electrons and neutrons. But when the number of electrons is thrown off balance, if there's one more than there should be or one less than there should be, there's an isothermic reaction, which creates an irregularity in elemental structures. So if something is exposed to radiation, it'll throw off its DNA, and that's what causes the cancer. That's what causes heat, the burning, radiation burns, and all of that. So the fact that mushrooms are able to absorb those elements without significantly affecting it is a huge deal. And it could, if humans involved themselves, we could help assist the process, making it go by a lot faster and more efficiently. And the same thing can be applied to Fukushima. We can use the same principles to help clean Fukushima. And I want to bring up the San Onofre nuclear plant that's in Southern California. It was built in the 1960s and was shut down in 2013. And to this day, they still store radioactive materials on site because they have nowhere to put it. They have nothing. It has nowhere to go. It's just sitting there because there's nothing they can do with it. And that site is just sitting there. In a perfect world, I believe that it is the perfect place to establish researchers on how we can utilize fungi to absorb the radioactive waste and prevent spillage, because it's only a matter of time until something collapses or something breaks down and radiation is exposed to its environment. Uranium mining. This is a very sad topic because a lot of people are still suffering from uranium deposits in their water, especially the Diné people, Diné territories. On this left picture, it's a map of the 521 abandoned mines throughout the Four Corners and Diné territories. And the picture on the right is just an example of a mine. And as you can see, like they dig into the earth and they pull everything out, and the land itself has become barren because of it. But there is research being done on like what kinds of plants and fungi can absorb uranium deposits. I believe tumbleweed was on the list, which is actually really good because that's one of the plants that naturally exist in those regions. But we can be utilizing microremediation to create filters to absorb any of the uranium that comes through any of the waterways, so that when it reaches people, when it finally goes onto the reservation, it's not so contaminated, it's not toxic, and it's a lot of inconsideration going on. So that's land restoration. We can talk about remediation and the afterwards Q&As and all that. But I want to give some shout outs before we get into that. I want to give a shout out to Hummingbird Farm on Ohlone Land in San Francisco, Segorte Lands Trust in Oakland, also Ohlone Land, Ishka Farms on Tipai territories, Kumeyaay Lands, San Isidro, and William Padilla Brown. So the first three shout outs, those are all farms, POC community-based farms. I really believe in the work that they're doing. It's really discouraging for the city dwellers to not have access to nature, to not have access to soil or healthy soil that we can put our hands in. So these organizations, they're really on top of their work. They're showing love to the lands, reconnecting with that knowledge and wisdom. And William Padilla Brown is a very brilliant citizen scientist. He is very big when on phycology, which is the study of algae, as well as he's a really big mycologist, and he's pretty known for his cordyceps. But I really recommend checking out all of these organizations and individuals. And if you could support my projects too, these are my Instagrams: Cenyeliztli Seeds and Barrio Bigfoot. Cenyeliztli Seeds is just a small org that I like to share environmental information. I like to share indigenous knowledge. Cenyeliztli itself, that word means the peoples. So it's the people's seeds. Like this is us. It's for us. Like whatever I do through that is for us. And it's never try never to be with selfish intent. And the Barrio Bigfoot, that's my personal creation account. If y'all want to check it out, no pressure. But yeah, that's my presentation. I'm gonna check out the comments for questions. Oh, I also did want to mention that I did create a table. I created a whole file on bioremediation. If you guys want to check it out, they can put a link to this file in the comments. This is just the stuff that I found so far. Like there's still so much more to add to these lists of what kinds of plants can remediate what kinds of elements. Yeah, and if you guys have any more resources to add to this, please reach out to me. And I just want this information to be as accessible as possible. So I'm gonna check these comments real quick.
Yes, we added the bioremediation article into the chat.
Thank you very much. So, would you happen to know if there's any research on mushrooms absorbing EMF, like radiation from Wi-Fi, etc.? So, I remember reading an article where someone was growing mushrooms near their modems and their satellites or whatever, and yeah, the mushrooms actually can grow more abundantly by being placed in those areas. Mushrooms are capable of absorbing a variety of forms of radiation because it's essentially just a different form of energy, and they're the most adaptable to absorbing energy. Let's see, this makes me think about possibilities for radiation. Puerto Rico, let's see, intestines. Yeah, so the government, man, they suck. And they are the number one polluters of this planet. All military in San Diego, the Navy is the number one polluter of this land. I live in Logan Heights, which is right next to the bay where the naval shipyards are at. And I live in the most contaminated neighborhood in San Diego County because of them. So that's part of why I'm so passionate about this stuff. Does bioremediation help with bacterial toxicity in soil as effectively as it does for toxic chemicals? I could not speak too much about that because I have not directly read anything about that, but I would anticipate it does. Because say when mycorrhiza protects the host or protect the root system from pests, they I'm sure they would protect from toxic bacteria as well, depending on the fungus itself. Ooh, I don't speak Spanish. I'm sorry. I will someday. I will try to the best of my ability. But yeah. So if you guys, I don't want to take up too much more time because this is technically supposed to be the lunchtime. Crystal, do you have anything to say about that? Should we do a breakout room, or?
Yes, I can set up a break.